Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world.
We have a budget agreement. This agreement will protect our economy and reduces the deficit.
It allows us to plan for the future, and as a consequence, will allow your departments to plan for the future.
A budget deal, a no shutdown? Let's see. Plus, what is the point of daylight saving, apart from an extra hour in bed? At last, a deal has been done to prevent the government shutdown in the US, which has been threatening President Obama for months. But the outgoing Republican Speaker, John Boehner, doesn't approve. He said this week, it stinks. Well, as usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson is in New York and the Conservative commentator Armstrong is in Washington. Jeffrey, this is a common sense deal, surely. Why should it stink?
I don't, because the Republicans think everything stinks. And I don't know that the deal is really done. It's got to get through the House. Don't forget there is something called the Freedom Caucus, which are the right-wing wacko lunatics in the House. And Freedom Caucus, by the way, is an oxymoron, who are not for governing. They're against just about everything. They have agreed to support Paul Ryan as Speaker, but they will extract the pound of flesh from him as well. They got rid of Boehner. They probably will get rid of Ryan within a year and cause more havoc. Whether or not they go for this budget, who knows? The idea of a shutdown is completely idiotic and stupid. And I suspect it could be ended by doing away with the debt ceiling, which is, as far as I understand it, we're the only country in the world who has this nonsensical thing. Do away with this debt ceiling vote, and you've solved part of the problem.
Would that be a solution, Armstrong, to do away with this repetitive debt ceiling vote? Or is it a good safeguard?
Well, look, and good morning and hello to everyone. Listen, we have to face the reality that the U.S. economy already has a near over $50 million debt and is on a path for bankruptcy that no one wants to talk about, and politicians from both of the major parties have shown they don't have the discipline and political will to make the tough decisions needed to balance the budget on their own. And I know the mere act of why they're passing the budget now has to do with the fact of the country's AAA credit rating, that you're going to ensure these low interest rates for investments and consumers. But at some point, you cannot, as a consumer, go out and spend $400,000 a month and you're only making $2,000 a month. You can't do that for decades and decades and not expect that your children and grandchildren are going to pay a huge price. So I think the criticism that you've got to reduce the debt, you've got to cut spending, you've got to make the hard choices is very legitimate. And I don't see how anybody of any kind of intelligence and common sense can argue against that.
Let's speak to the man known as the budget guy, Stan Collender. He's the Executive Vice President and National Director of Finance at Qorvis. Stan, thanks for being with us today. Do you think this government, at this stage, all the various parties are coming together to reach some kind of sensible deal?
Look, I'm not sure how sensible it is. It's a deal. That's the thing that's important. It will probably get us past the debt ceiling issue. That is, the government, U.S. government won't default. And it will probably provide enough momentum so that there won't be a government shutdown on December 11th, that Congress will and the president will agree on spending bills that will keep the government operating. And it will keep this in place, through the 2016 election until the next Congress and the next president, take office. But let's not talk about this as if it's a panacea. It's not a change in fiscal policy. It's just a political deal to get everyone past the next election. And just to correct a couple of misperceptions, this doesn't avoid a shutdown. This deal doesn't avoid a shutdown on its own. Congress will still have to pass other legislation, and that's very much up in the air. There will still be riders on Planned Parenthood and some of the other issues that have stymied everything so far. Second, there is no indication that the government needs to pay back its debt. In fact, it's a bipartisan type of situation. When George Bush took over in 2000, that we were facing a $6.7 trillion surplus that would have paid off the debt in the next 10 years. And he decided to have a tax cut with it that put us on the road to more debt. So, and in the meantime, the demand for U.S. Treasuries is strong. That the world is not, expressing any dissatisfaction with U.S. finances. So I'm not sure this is a bad situation at all. We'll get through this deal without having to cause it the kind of chaos we've had in the past.
But Stan, just address Jeffrey's idea, would you, that this whole idea of politicians having to routinely coming back and vote to give the government approval to raise the debt ceiling, does that really work?
Yeah, actually, it works in almost every other country around the world, the UK, for example. But look, the correct time to do an increase in the debt ceiling or to allow the government to borrow money is when you pass the budget. So when the Republican House and Senate this past year passed a budget, they should have also included in that, an increase in the amount the government could borrow to match the deficit in that budget. They didn't do that. Instead, as Jeffrey was saying, we have a separate vote. That's nonsensical, the separate vote. You shouldn't be able to vote for a budget that requires you to spend more money and then refuse to allow the government to borrow the money that you're required to spend. That's what's nonsensical.
Let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong on this point. It does seem a bit of a shenanigans for a government to go through, though, Jeffrey, doesn't it? But it's a good discipline, isn't it, to revisit these things?
No. The separate vote on the debt ceiling is idiotic and completely nonsensical.
Why so?
When you vote the budget, or if you don't vote a budget and use last year's budget, it should be inherently understood that the government has the right to borrow to fund all of this. And as I say, I think that we are the only country in the world who actually votes the debt ceiling as a separate vote. All it does is open up the door for the right-wing wackos in the House to disrupt government, which is what they're there to do. They're not there to govern. They're there to cause problems. Why give them that opportunity?
Jeffrey, they're part of the government. They were elected to take on those roles.
That's right. I agree. They were elected, and they should not be allowed to disrupt the government. They were elected to govern, actually, and they're there, and they should be governing. And there are a whole bunch of them, the 40 or 50 of this nonsensical Freedom Caucus, who openly state that they don't want to govern. I mean, Listen, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate said the day that Barack Obama was elected, my job is to make sure he's a one-term president. This is crazy. This is crazy. There are so many problems that need to be worked out. I don't hold a lot of hope for Paul Ryan to negotiate anything because I think he's just a fringe wacko. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for a little bit, and hopefully he can work with the Democrats and get something done because the American people need it to be done.
Jeffrey, let's get Armstrong to chip in on this. Jeffrey, with his usual colourful ways, Armstrong criticising a lot of the politicians in Washington. Does this not damage the reputation of the body politic?
Well, of course. Sometimes I even wonder if people really understand the debt ceiling and that even though Congress has appropriated money, the Treasury still can't borrow more than Congress allows it to do. And if the credit limit Congress has set on itself is less than the amount of deficit spending Congress has authorized, then we'll bump into the ceiling. And I don't think that people also understand that we understand that there are dire consequences if we were to shut down. It's more than just because in actuality you won't have a government shutdown. I mean, per se, in the same sense that the money isn't appropriated and that you cannot spend that. What you will have is a government shutdown in the sense that we don't have the money. So the thing with the traditional government shutdown is that mandatory programs more or less keeps on functioning since they're mandatory. But Congress doesn't have to reapprove spending every year. So they're not affected, guys, by a shutdown, though the administration of those programs might be.
Here in the UK, the Conservative government, as it is now, it was in coalition until quite recently, made great hay about the virtue of financial probity by saying, let's fix the roof when the sun's shining. And they criticised their opponents for not doing that. Successive governments in America had the chance to fix this lending, didn't they? And this huge amount of debt mountain that's piling up, Stan, and nobody did. Why didn't they do that?
All right. First of all, I disagree with your characterization of the debt as huge. It's relative to other countries. It's not relative to previous times in U.S. history. It's not. And again, you judge huge, small, whatever by the market. And the market is saying, don't worry about it. In fact, it's growing smaller than at a smaller pace than the economy. which is the level at which most economists would tell you it's fine. But look, this is a political question. As you heard from the two political pundits you have before me disagreeing rather dramatically, Bill Clinton ran 4 consecutive surpluses. That was under a Democratic administration, and had that continued, there was a projection of a $6.7 trillion surplus over the next 6 years, but that was burning a hole in, at the time, the president and Congress's pocket, and they wanted to give it back, in this case, in tax cuts. Other presidents, other Congresses would have done the same thing with the surplus with spending. You're never, I'm going to repeat this as strongly and say this as strongly as I possibly can, paying off the debt is the least politically popular alternative. Members of Congress and any president would much rather spend it on things their constituents want or give them a tax cut. So we are never going to pay off the national debt in the United States.
That's an interesting proposition, Jeffrey. Never do it. I mean, why bother, I suppose, if the markets are going to lend you the money?
Well, also, I mean, just look at the way corporate America works, issuing shares. That's corporate debt when you issue the shares. I mean, and what I love about Armstrong's answer on the debt ceiling is that it shows he actually understands less about the debt ceiling than his friend Ben Carson, who understands nothing about it. He was asked about it and completely embarrassed himself by blowing the answer and showing that he has no understanding whatsoever of how the government works. And he's leading the Iowa polls along, the way Michelle Bachmann did. Good luck to them both. The other thing is that the shutdown doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Of course it matters, because they stopped paying Social Security and they stopped paying retired military. What do you do when the families in America start going broke because the government's not functioning and they have no way of picking up the money that they need to live? A shutdown is completely irresponsible. And who did it twice to us? The Republicans. I mean, how much more warning about the crazy politics do we need in this country than to get rid of the bums, throw all the Republicans out, get a Democratic President, Hillary, get a Democratic Congress and a Democratic Senate, and let's move the country forward again.
Yeah,
we cannot afford the Republicans.
Getting all three, as you well know, Jeffrey, is slightly unlikely, as I understand my American politics. Armstrong, come in on this. What does Paul Ryan have to do if he gets the job, and by the time this programme is broadcast, he may well have got the job. If he does, what does he have to do now?
Look, it's authority versus power. He may have the power, but he may not have the authority. There are a lot of factions that he has to deal with because, you know what, he can never cut and never do enough in terms of the conservative factions that he has to sort of work together with. You guys mentioned the markets, okay? It's interesting because if the markets decide that we have defaulted in our debt using whichever definition that Jeffrey wants to choose to use, I don't think we really have the appetite to find out which way they would use it. That would cause the cost of our debt to increase dramatically. That would mean that the amount we have to pay on interest, which is currently almost around $250 billion a year, $250 billion a year, would explode and make it even harder for us to dig out of the hole we're in. It could also make it much more expensive to get future debt. It could also set a chain of events that could cause an economic death spiral for our country. The United States economy, and I know Jeffrey doesn't want to hear this, could quite possibly be left in ruins. It's just a fact.
And that's what the Republicans want. That's what they're campaigning for. Stop the government. This is crazy.
Stan, to what extent does this bickering in Washington, with all the colourful language that goes with it, does it impact on the electorate, do you think? Do they make a judgment about all this when they get their chance to vote next year?
Well, I mean, clearly, if you look at the polls, Congress is at its lowest point of approval rating, maybe in history. It's about a 12% approval rating. If you had that in the UK, there'd be almost an immediate call for elections. Yeah. We just don't have that here. So, yeah, it's having an impact, but it's not necessarily going to do what Jeffrey was saying, which is get people to vote Democrat, and it's not going to get Democrats to vote Republican in an opposite situation. We're so hyper-partisan here that the other side can't do anything right. Compromise is now considered collaborating with the enemy.
What does a shutdown look like? Does it matter? Does it damage the Republicans?
Look, it has damaged them before. We can say that. They paid a huge price for it. But, I think Stan is right. I think what Stan is saying on a deeper level, and I don't necessarily have the confidence or the comfort that he has, that we have been at the precipice before. We've been at this place before. and they find a way to correct themselves. It may not be the best answer in terms of principle, but they find the political thing to do to kick the ball down the road, and they continue to kick the can down the road. And I'm saying to Stan, how long before we kick the can down the road, because before there's no can left to kick?
We're not just passing debt on to our children and grandchildren. We're also passing on the increases, the changes in the economy that we're making, the positive changes, the defense of the country, the infrastructure that we're building. We're passing those along. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton, to go back 250, 300 years, was strong about the U.S. debt, U.S. having a debt, because it allowed the economy to grow faster than it otherwise would grow. We're at a point now where if we're going to make changes, it would have to be small and incremental over a long period of time. And I don't think anybody in this country has got the stomach for that. But one thing in terms of hurting the Republicans, Martin, after the last shutdown in 2012, the Republicans won enough seats to take over the Senate and picked up 12 seats in the House. So it's sometimes hard to convince the Freedom Caucus that Jeffrey was talking about that there's any downside to a government shutdown.
On Twitter, you can find him as The Budget Guy. It's Stan Collender. Thanks for being with us today, Stan.
My pleasure.
Reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, on Roku, and catch up, and of course, at skynews.com/US. It's time to fall back. Yes, daylight saving is over for another year. It was in the UK and Europe last week. This week, it happens in the US. But fewer and fewer countries are changing their time. Here's our map of how things have changed over the last few years. 2/3 of the world subtracted an hour twice yearly. Now you can see it's only about 1/3 of the globe. Quite a change. Well, Professor Michael Downing from Tufts University is the author of the book Spring Forward, the Annual Madness of Daylight Saving Time. Madness, you call it, Professor. Why so?
Well, partly because since the moment people began to toy with their clocks in the hopes of achieving something which is not quite clear, it seems no one has actually understood what we're doing. It might be, of course, that the idea of losing or gaining an hour by sticking your finger into the face of the clock is at best theoretical, or maybe it's philosophical.
But the statisticians talk about all sorts of moves that it helps, doesn't it? It helps with road accident deaths. It helps with people being more effective in their job. Mind you, extrapolated across the entire world economy, I suppose the stats are a bit challengeable.
Well, I think none of the statistics really hold up to scrutiny, and the most important one that all nations were sold on early in the 20th century was a saving with energy, thus daylight saving time. But it turns out we've yet to be able to save a drop of oil. In fact, daylight saving tends to invert all of our expectations, thus the confusion. For instance, it turns out to be a terrible energy waster in the West.
Tell me why?
Well, there are two simple reasons. The first thing is people's energy use really isn't as predictable as it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So we no longer have 8-hour days. We have 24-hour days and demand our electricity when we need it. But more importantly, the petroleum industry has understood since about the 1930s something very simple, which the governments have never measured. And that is, if you give people more sunlight at the end of the day, they really do leave their homes. But when people leave their homes, they go to the park and they go to the mall and they don't walk there. Daylight saving increases leisure driving.
OK, let me bring in the other guys now, if we may. Armstrong standing by for us in Washington once again. Do you find it a pain changing the clocks twice a year?
No, actually, it's wonderful. I'm going to challenge my guest and his discussions about the decrease in electricity demand. I think this is highly affected by the geographical location, especially in some locations there may be positive effects and in others it may be negative. But it still is a reduction in electricity usage. But there are also recreational benefits that people don't talk about in terms of boosting the economy. And there's really an increased consumption and a reduction of pedestrian accidents and crimes. If you live in a city like Washington, D.C., there are far fewer accidents because more people are driving when the sun is out, which is safer than when they're in the dark. There's no question that there's less crime. So there are these recreational benefits with daylight saving time. And also, if you are an employer especially in the evening. It gives you that extra hour of daylight where you accomplish more. I mean, it's very highly productive time. So listen, while people may criticize it, and especially remember, this started with us in Germany. Germany really, in all practical terms, introduced us to daylight savings time. But the reason why the United States really caught fire with it was right after World War II, especially right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The United States introduced us to daylight savings time because it has a huge impact on its productivity and in fact, moving in a very strategic way. That 1 hour was a huge difference for us in terms of our strategy going forward in World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
But
so we may get lost.
Armstrong, it is a bit random, though, isn't it? I mean, you do it at one time. We in the UK do it in sync with Europe. Jeffrey, even in our country, the Scots don't like it as much as the English because there's a complete difference in the amount of daylight from north to south. In a country the size of the United States, I imagine if you're up on the border with Canada, you might quite like it. If you're down in Florida, you can't see the hell of the point of it, surely.
Well, as a matter of fact, in Arizona, they don't do it. But Arizona houses the Navajo Nation, goes across 3 states. And the Navajo Nation that is in Arizona does do it. However, inside the Navajo Nation is the Hopi Nation. It's like a donut, and the donut hole is the Hopi Nation. They don't do it. I mean, I love these absurdities. I think it's kind of amusing. Apparently, it was Ben Franklin who first proposed it. That may or may not be urban myth. But it was an Englishman named William Wilmette, who was a builder in London in 1905, who actually made a serious proposal. And Armstrong is perfectly right. It was the Germans in World War I and their Axis powers who did it. And I remember, and I agree totally with Armstrong on this, and I questioned the professor because back in 1973, at the height of the oil crisis, and I don't know the statistics, perhaps he does, Richard Nixon said, we're going to go to daylight saving time for 8 months of the year to save on energy. And I believed at the time it was quite a benefit, also reducing accidents.
Michael,
maybe the professor knows the statistics on that.
Well, Michael Downing, isn't the actual process of changing costly? Can you put a number on that?
There has been a work economist who's done a study who says it costs us something over $1 billion to change the clocks. But, facts are funny things, and they tend to be pretty reliable. Richard Nixon, who had been a longtime opponent of daylight saving, did, in fact, perform the first peacetime year-round daylight saving, trying to stem the effects of the oil embargo. It was a total bust. Within 3 months, he had to call it off. It not only didn't save energy, it put school children on dark streets, and there were accidents where people actually ran into kids, and it was called off. The only longitudinal study we have ever had of electricity was done by a great economist who's now at Yale University, Matthew Kuchin, and he showed us that in 1 year of daylight saving in Indiana, it cost the Hoosiers about $16 million in extra energy. It's really never been an effective savings policy. It's a great retail spending policy, and that's why your 2 speakers sound like possibly they're in the same camp as the Chamber of Commerce, who has long been the biggest supporter of daylight saving in the United States.
They're both laughing here, Professor. And Armstrong, why so? Because people... Well, let me just check with the professor. They spend more money because the clocks are changing? How so?
It's remarkable, but it's true. It does have a social benefit of pushing people outside of the house. And you can easily measure this by the fact that every year, the Nielsen ratings for television take a huge drop by 15% as soon as we turn to daylight saving. It's why the TV and movie industries have always hated and opposed daylight saving. But here's what happens. When we leave our houses, we tend to go outside. We look at our houses. We think they need repair. We go to the parks. We play baseball. The golf industry in 1986, these are their estimates, when we went from 6 months to 7 months in the States on daylight saving, the golf industry said that extra month was worth $400 million just in greens fees and additional equipment. The barbecue industry said the same month was worth $250 million in additional grill sales. It's a tremendous retail spending plan.
Armstrong, why not keep it, though? If there's a benefit in moving the hour forward during the summer months, maybe just stay there for the winter, too.
Well, you know what? Look, I'm a proponent of changing the clock. As an employer, as someone who works out early in the morning, that extra hour. Listen, it's all, and also as growing up as a farmer, it was a great benefit for us as farmers. That's why I said the geography is very important. And so, you know, and it's true. It works for some and some that it doesn't work for. It just depends on your profession, your geography, and the time that you have to travel to work and back and forth. So many people, it just boils down to a personal preference. But there was a time when America and the world was quite different, especially in wartime. The change was significant.
And Jeffrey, there's a few more habits the Americans have still got. I mean, you have a hugely long summer break for your school kids, don't you? Largely dating back to sort of everybody going out in the fields to gather the harvest.
Yes, and Armstrong and I are both on our tractors in daylight savings time just before the sunrise, I'm sure. But I have a unique approach to fall back. I don't turn my clocks back on Saturday night. I save my hour. And then a week or two later, when I'm doing something that I really enjoy doing and saying, gee, I wish I could keep doing it, then I turn my clocks back and I get an extra hour. It's a great solution.
But notwithstanding Jeffrey's brilliant ideas, Professor, it is another problem, isn't it, for industry as a whole? We just had instance of hacking and computer problems on a massive scale over in the UK over the last 10 days or so. This is another potential glitch, isn't it, when the global computer systems start having to be readjusted or reprogrammed?
Well, it's a problem when individual nations and in the states, individual states change their policy and the industries who program all of our devices haven't caught up with it, so we have the wrong time. So it does cause problems like that. And let's face it, clock time has a very limited utility. It's synchronicity and predictability. And with all these different dates for changing clocks, it does sort of throw off synchronicity. I just want to also add, I think your two guests are very noble, but I think they're the only two farmers who actually favor daylight saving. It's again one of the myths. The farmers were the lobby most vociferously opposed to daylight saving in the history. It's why here in the States, we never had a national daylight policy until 1966. The farmers hated it because they actually used morning sunlight.
Professor Michael Downing, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Good luck over there.
And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku, on Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.